human beings are social animals, and we respond to the environments we're in. You take a good person, you put them in a bad environment, they do bad things. You take somebody who maybe has performed bad acts, maybe is considered untrustworthy, you put them in a good environment, they'll turn their lives around and become remarkable, trustworthy members of society. We're social animals, we respond to the environments we're in. Leaders are supposed to produce the environments that produce, you get the environment right, you get trust and cooperation. You get the environment wrong, you get cynicism, paranoia, mistrust, and self-interest. It's just a biological reaction. So if we have the science on our side, we have case studies on our side, it begs the question, why doesn't everybody do it? And what I've come to learn is because these strategies that you guys employed, it is hard to predict the time in which you will see the benefit from those decisions. And companies don't like that. Companies like to know that on this day, we can measure that the number will be what we want it to be, right? They prefer consistency over, they prefer intensity over consistency. And if you consider you can't go to the gym for 9 hours and get into shape, but if you work out every single day for 20 minutes, you absolutely will get into shape, 100%. The problem is, I don't know when. I just know it will work, right? It's like brushing your teeth. And businesses prefer intensity because they want to demonstrate X savings on X day and have that very easily measured. The strategies that you guys employed, we don't know when you'll see the fruits. We just know it'll work. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of organizations. The leadership crisis has nothing to do with the presidency. I think we've had a leadership crisis for quite some time, and it's been steadily getting worse over the past 20 or 30 years. And it's primarily due to the fact that we misunderstand what leadership is, and the strategies and the ways we're building our organizations are based on the false definition of leadership. Let me give you an example. So in business, for example, too many of our standard business philosophies today, the way we normally run businesses, are leftovers from philosophies and ideas that were introduced in the 80s and 90s. So, for example, the concept of shareholder supremacy was a theory proposed in the late 1970s, popularized in the 80s and 90s, and is now the standard way of doing business. Remember, the 80s and 90s were boom years, relative peace in the world, a kinder and gentler Cold War, and so a lot of the ideas that we were generating on how to lead and how to build our businesses were based on those conditions. In other words, when boom years are there, we sort of become a little more selfish, right? So shareholder supremacy was a theory proposed back then, popularized in the 80s and 90s. Now it's standard way of doing business and arguably hasn't been a successful experiment. Every CEO of every public company, it's a big open secret, hates the analyst community, hates Wall Street, yet they play the game. The concept of using mass layoffs to balance the books, which is now standard practice in so many large businesses, public and private, that we don't even recognize how destructive it is to the human spirit and to the culture of an organization, did not exist in the United States prior to the 1980s. Did not exist. But it was popularized in the 80s and 90s and now has become normal. And so you see a lot of those sort of me first and putting the organization before the people, or numbers before people, really in government policy and in business that are now standard today. These are very, very different times, and I think that leadership hasn't kept up with the times. The organizations that understand prioritizing human beings, the life of a human being over the abstraction of a number, Bob Chapman runs a company called Barry Waymiller. It's about a $2 or $3 billion business, about 8,000 employees. Good old-fashioned American manufacturing. So when Kimberly-Clark needs a machine to make toilet paper, Barry Waymiller makes that machine. And if you ask Bob, what does the company do, he won't tell you we're in manufacturing. He'll tell you that we're building extraordinary people to do extraordinary things. And if you ask Bob, how does he know he's successful, he'll say, we measure success by the way we touch the lives of people. And he firmly believes these things. And I've written about Bob in Leaders Eat Last. It's how I came to know him, about somebody who truly understands that business is a people thing. And I'll give you one example of how he's different. So in 2008, during the recession, Barry Waymiller was hit very, very hard by the recession. Of course, in recessionary times, large capital expenditures get cut first, and so that affects buying new machinery. And they lost 30% of their pipeline like that. So like so many companies, they couldn't afford their labor pool. And like so many companies, the board got together and said to Bob, you need to have layoffs. You need to save $10 million. And Bob absolutely refused. And instead what they did is they implemented a furlough program where every employee had to take 4 weeks of unpaid vacation. They didn't have to take it consecutively, and they could take it whenever they wanted. Everybody from secretary to CEO. And when Bob announced the program to the company, he said, it's better we should all suffer a little than any of us should have to suffer a lot. And morale went up. And what happens in well-led organizations is when leadership demonstrates a care for us as human beings, the biological reaction to those conditions is we actually start caring for each other much more. So in most organizations, when leadership cares more about numbers than us and will sacrifice our lives to meet some arbitrary projection, we hunker down and we become paranoid and self-interested and mistrustful, right? Well, something happened at Barry-Wehmiller that nobody expected, and it wasn't part of the program, which is people who could afford it more started trading with those who could afford it less. So some would take 5 weeks so that others only had to take 3. In other words, the people started taking care of each other. The recession, they got out of the recessionary times, the furlough program was done away with, they restored the 401k program they had frozen, they actually back paid on 401k from where they had frozen it, good luck hiring any of those employees even if you offer them more money. They will not leave. And the productivity, innovation, and intensity of this organization is absolutely unbelievable. And he completely went against what is considered standard on how we treat how we fix problems. What we see in politics is it's a clear mirror of what's happening in business. They're one and the same, where short term has been prioritized over long term, where what's in it for the organization has been prioritized over what's in it for the community. And whereas an organization, in public companies, for example, meeting some arbitrary projection on some arbitrary date and meeting some analysts' projection. I'll tell you a quick funny story aside. Gary Ridge, who's the CEO of WD-40, great company, his analyst called him up on the analyst call, chastised him and said, you missed your numbers. And Gary said, no, I missed your numbers, mine are fine. But what we see in politics is people prioritizing their re-election over doing something great. I had a conversation with a member of Congress, I will leave their name out of it, and in a moment of, it was a very uncomfortable conversation, uncomfortable for them, not for me, where I basically said, I know human beings, I know people in uniform who would risk their lives and have risked their lives to do the right thing. I said, you won't even sacrifice your job to do the right thing. And I said, here's the joke. If you lost your election, you'll get picked up by some lobbying group or some law firm anyway, and you will make triple the money you're making now. So what exactly are you losing? Like, where is the sacrifice exactly? And she actually agreed. She said that we absolutely do prioritize getting reelected over some of the decisions we have to make, and then has this ridiculous rationalization that because if I don't win my reelection, I can't do good, which is a backwards logic. You do good, and if you do good, hopefully you'll win your reelection sometimes, and you can still do good even if you don't get reelected. Like they're not mutually exclusive. And I think this started. I think one of the problems is that it's become a competitive environment, politics, and it's no longer a cooperative environment. And I think we can trace it back to Newt Gingrich's contract with America, where he was the first one to tell members, because remember, when you got elected to national office, what you would do is you'd move your family to Washington, and you would fight on the floor during the day, but then you'd all go to PTA meetings together at night and sit in the bleachers and watch your kids play ball together, and you knew each other as human beings, and you saw each other as human beings. Now they come to Washington by themselves, they work for 2.5 days, then they go back to home, they don't move their families, and they don't actually know each other. Sometimes even within their own party. They literally have no human and social interactions, so they only see each other as competitors, not as people. I think this is a very destructive way to run any organization. We all know this, that it's difficult to develop relationships at a distance. We all know that it's much easier to resolve conflict when we're in a room together fighting with somebody as opposed to typing it or sending mean emails to each other. No, leadership has nothing to do with rank. Leadership is a responsibility. It's not about being in charge, it's about taking care of those in your charge. And I know many people who sit at the highest levels of organizations, we all do, who are not leaders. They have authority and we do as they tell us because they have authority over us, but we would not follow them. And we all know people who are very junior in organizations who have no authority, but they've made the choice to look after the person to the left of them, and they've made the choice to look after the person to the right of them, and that's why we call them leaders. Leaders are not necessarily the ones in charge, they're the ones with the courage to go first towards the unknown, first towards the danger, first to be humiliated because it's the right thing. And the amazing thing is the reason we call them leaders is because when they do that, others follow. And it really is a courage thing. So then it begs the question, where does courage come from? Spending time with folks in the military who, what I've learned is courage is not some deep internal fortitude. Like you don't dig down deep and find the courage. It actually is an external thing. So when I got to meet people who'd risked their lives, I asked them, why did you do it? You have a family, you have kids, no one would have faulted you if you didn't do it, no one would have ordered you to do what you did, why did you do it? They all give the same answer, because they would have done it for me. In other words, when we have the belief that someone has our backs, when we have the absolute certainty that someone cares about us and is there by our side and believes in us, we actually are able to do extraordinary things. But without those relationships, it's very hard to muster courage. Some world-famous trapeze artist is not going to try a brand new death-defying act for the first time without a net. It's the net. It's that external thing that gives us the courage to do difficult things. In other words, it goes back to human relationships again. And so when we foster those relationships, when we foster the love in the community, we actually have the courage to do what you're saying we need to do. But when we don't, when politicians and businessmen, when we all feel lonely in positions of rank, I think that actually hurts the ability to lead. And it goes back to Milton Friedman. We have the standard definition that we sort of embrace as the definition of business and the responsibility of companies is a Milton Friedman definition. And he said, where's the effect of, the purpose of business is to maximize profits within the bounds of the law, which I think is a completely wrong definition. It's a very, morality and ethics are a higher standard than the law. And we hear it all the time when organizations do things that we know are wrong, they make us uncomfortable and we question them. They all say the same thing, we broke no laws. I mean, here's the analogy, right? Which is, the Titanic, the builders of the Titanic, when they built that ship, the laws and regulations that governed lifeboats back then were built for the biggest ships that existed in the time, which were ferries. And the Titanic was 4 times bigger than the biggest ferry. So there was no lifeboats for all regulation. It didn't exist. It was based on numbers. So the makers of the Titanic, because it was too expensive to put all lifeboats for all, actually put the maximum number of lifeboats as required by regulation on the Titanic, which was a quarter of what the size of the boat actually was, right? But they actually left berths for future lifeboats, knowing that eventually the regulations would catch up, right? So the Titanic hits an iceberg. We all know the story. Do you know how many people died on the Titanic versus how many were saved? 25% of the people who were aboard the Titanic were saved. 25%. 3/4 died. In other words, about the number of lifeboats they didn't have. They broke no laws. But clearly, morality says, shouldn't you have a lifeboat for everyone? Even though they broke no laws. Now that's the analogy for the way I think too much of business is conducted, which is it's conducted with the bounds of the law, where everybody knows that there's a morality that they're missing, and they know that eventually the regulations will catch up, but I don't understand why people don't act morally despite the law. I'm surprised by that, to be honest. The whole idea that they're better at the end makes more sense because you know, if you want candid advice, you ask an old person because they don't care what you think about them. And happiness studies show that as well. People are at their happiest when they're young because they're oblivious. And they're happiest when they're old.
He didn't say clueless. He said oblivious.
And they're happiest when they're old because they've faced their own mortality and they're at peace. And like they don't care what you think about them anymore. And people actually at their least happiest in middle age, where you're most concerned what everybody thinks about you and if you're successful and if you're good looking, and if you're doing well and all of that stuff. And so the idea that empathy would actually go down later, the only thing that I could react to that is, have they just become jaded? I'm surprised by it, to be honest. And maybe it goes to that thing that they don't care what you think about them anymore. I don't. They don't have to be all wrapped up in the emotion of the people that they're serving, but they have a deep-seated belief that the right thing to do is to take care of the people because it's the right thing to do. So perhaps being empathetically disconnected actually makes it easier to be compassionate because it becomes intellectualized, as opposed to, because we can make stupid decisions based on empathy because there's too much feeling. Where you can actually say the right thing. I think it's the moral compass. I think it sounds like the moral compass grows, even though I'm not personally invested emotionally in the decisions of what's happening. I just know it's the right thing to do. I wonder if you need to have empathy when you're actually physically more connected with your team. And then later, as you gain seniority, that's where compassion is, because the people you're physically connected with is going to be a senior group of people. You're not going to be connected with, the rank and file. So you can't actually have empathy with people that you have no relationship with. So you actually need compassion. I wonder if that's the thing, because in a company-size group of soldiers, Marines, whatever, it's about 200 people. And even if you get smaller than that, you talk to folks in the military and they'll say that they can judge when a young lieutenant is a good lieutenant because of the way that the troops refer to him or her. They'll say, that's our lieutenant, as opposed to the lieutenant. It's always the colonel, because it's too far, it's always the colonel. But that's our lieutenant. And when the troops make the transition from the lieutenant to our lieutenant, that means there's a relationship. And I think at that level, you need to have empathy. You need to know your troops, you need to know their names, you need to know their faces, you need to know their families. I think in business, you need to know your people, you need to know the names of their kids, you need to know where they live, what goes on in their lives. But as you become disconnected physically, I think that's where compassion, that makes perfect sense. I don't like the term happiness. I like the term fulfillment. I like the term joy. Happiness to me is something that is fleeting, and you can have happiness because you win the piece of business, or you hit your numbers, or you go see a movie, and happiness is wonderful and it's great, and then it goes away. It doesn't last. Where deep fulfillment, like love.
Meaning,
purpose, all of that kind of stuff.
Or you could say the why.
The why, yeah.
As it were.
But deep fulfillment, I think, is a much higher standard. Let me equate it to, like, you don't like your kids every day, but you love your kids every day. It's that kind of thing.
This is true.
Yeah.
This is true.
And so
deep truth, friend.
You don't have to be happy every day, but you can be fulfilled every day. You don't have to like your job every day, but you can love your job every day. And I think that people confuse the two, and people are seeking happiness in their work, and they're doing it through all the ways you would think they would do it in short-term things. So, like, and you see it the way we lead young people too, which is we put in free food and bean bags and all these fun things at the office because we want to make our employees happy, and it absolutely works. It just doesn't make them fulfilled, and they still are unhappy and they still quit, or they still are unfulfilled and they still quit. And I think this is the problem. I think we've confused the terms because they're not the same. So I'm more interested in people finding deep fulfillment in their work, and I'm sure they will find happiness throughout that also. You don't be like, look under a rock and be like, I found happiness. I found the job I love. You know, it's like, you don't find love either. Like you find somebody who cares about you, that you care about, you fall in love. I'm not sure exactly what day it happened, and then you work tirelessly every day to stay in love. Because if you stop working, the love goes away. And it's the same at work. You don't find a job you love. You find a place where you share the values, you fit, they care about you as a human being, you fall in love with your job, and you work tirelessly every day to take care of the people around you, and you remain fulfilled. So I think the whole concept of searching for happiness, or searching for the job that you love, or searching for love is completely misguided. It's finding an area where you could work hard at it, and then you have to work hard to keep it. And the worst part is so do they. And if one of you quits, then the thing goes haywire. And that goes for employees and for management, which is they have to work hard, but at this, and so do we. So I think our language is not helping us. I've become obsessed with game theory. It's fascinating stuff. So whenever there's at least two competitors in a system, you have a game, and the rules of game theory apply. And if you know the rules of the game, you can do well. If you don't know the rules of the game, you're not going to do well. The vast majority of organizations who are in a contest actually do not understand the rules of their game, which means most organizations are heading towards zero, which I am fascinated by. So here's the quick of it. There are two types of games. There are finite games and there are infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and an agreed-upon objective. Baseball. We know the rules. We all agree whoever has more runs at the end of 9 innings is the winner, and we all go home. When you have an infinite game, infinite games are defined as known and unknown players. The rules are changeable, and the objective is to perpetuate the game, to keep the game in play. When you put a finite player versus a finite player, the system is stable. Baseball is stable. When you put an infinite player versus an infinite player, the system is also stable, like the Cold War. Because you cannot have a winner or a loser in the Cold War, right? So you keep the game in play. And what happens in infinite contests is players drop out of the game when they run out of the will or the resources to play. But the game perpetuates with or without them, right? So the game of business is an infinite game. The game of business has pre-existed every single company on the planet. It will outlast every single company on the planet. There's no such thing as winning the game of business. It doesn't exist. And when one player goes bankrupt or is merged or acquired, they drop out of the game, and another competitor will replace them. A new company will emerge. A new technology will emerge. But if you listen to the language of business, we very quickly see that most businesses actually don't know the game they're in. They talk about being number one, beating their competition, being the best, based on what agreed upon objectives, based on what agreed upon time frame. So that means when you're playing by finite rules in infinite contests, you will quickly go to zero. So here's a real life example. I spoke at an education summit for Microsoft. I also spoke at an education summit for Apple. At the Microsoft summit, the vast majority of the executives spent most of their PowerPoint presentations talking about how to beat Apple. At the Apple summit, 100% of the executives spend 100% of their presentations talking about how to help teachers teach and how to help students learn. One was obsessed with where they were going. The other one was obsessed with beating their competition. Guess which one is in quagmire, right? So at the end of my talk at Microsoft, they gave me a new Zune when it was a thing. That was their competitor to the iPod. And this thing was spectacular. It was the most gorgeous piece of technology I've ever used. The user interface was beautiful. It was simple. It was user-friendly. It was really fantastic. But of course, nobody ever bought one because it's a different story. When I was done working at Apple, I was sharing a taxi with a senior Apple executive. Did I ever tell you this? I was sharing a taxi with a senior Apple executive, sort of employee number 12 kind of guy. So I decided to stir the pot. It's a bad habit. And I turn to him and I say, you know, I was at Microsoft and they gave me the new Zune, and it is so much better than your iPod Touch. And he turned to me and he said, I have no doubt. Conversation over. Because an infinite player understands sometimes you're ahead and sometimes you're behind. Sometimes they have a better product, sometimes you have a better product. The objective is not to win every battle, the objective is to outlast them. And so one organization is making strategic decisions for a short-term gain of beating their competition based on some arbitrary number and arbitrary time frame that they picked, whereas the other organization is being built for resilience. And I love that. There's over 80% of the Dow index are companies 35 years or younger. Where are all the old companies? The best infinite players, this is right to your point, the best infinite players, they love having a worthy adversary. So Montgomery kept a portrait of Rommel in his quarters. They had deep respect for each other, and they loved the idea of competing against each other intellectually and besting each other. But they considered each other worthy adversaries. And so I think it's very important for teams or companies to view their competition as worthy adversaries rather than someone to beat. So in order to play the infinite game, you have to have teamwork and you have to take care of your people. Because if you only, if the entire organization is built on a sort of hit the goal, get the bonus, hit the goal, get the bonus, hit the goal, get the bonus, you can actually create an organization where people be competitive against each other, not with each other, and in time it'll destroy the internal culture. So building strong teams and prioritizing people is the only way to play the infinite game, because it also builds into it a resilience beyond the personality of the person at the top. Because very often you'll see some wonderful, wonderful organizations with this wonderful inspired leader, but they cannot survive the loss of their inspired leaders. We saw it happen at Walmart. Sam Walton was great, and then he left. And then Mike Duke eventually came in, you're like, you have to be kidding me, you know? Total opposite kind of leader. And we see that all too often. And so you can only play the infinite game if people see that their responsibility is to take the torch and carry it forwards, not to sort of be in the best job. You know, nobody's vying politically for the #1 job kind of thing. So it's essential for the infinite game. And in terms of the social world, I rail the fact that we distinguish the two as separate. It drives me nuts. I hate the fact that we call not-profits non-profits. That's a tax delineation. No one wants to be defined by what they aren't. It also makes money a dirty thing, not profit. You need money to sustain. Money is fuel. You can have a beautiful car, no fuel, don't go. And then and charity is a terrible word as well, as if we're doing something for free, right? I think they should call themselves for-impact organizations, right? I work for a for-impact organization, and by the way, you better be profitable, but you define profit differently. If your objective is to rescue kittens from trees, then you better be rescuing more kittens from trees this month than you were last month. That is profit. So the money is the fuel, and the profit is defined by whatever your cause is, and you're in the for-impact space. But the rules are all the same for both organizations. So I was at the Southern Company thing this morning where we were talking about just that, and there was some language that I realized Arthur and I have been saying that some of the language sort of hijacks us, unfortunately, and I think the language of sustainability is the wrong language, because sustainability is it sounds like a liberal philosophy, and I think the word that we should be using is resilience. I think, is our planet resilient? Are we helping the planet be resilient? Are our organizations resilient? Because if we're relying on limited fossil fuels, that's not resilient. And so I think we've done I think the climate scientists have done a bad job marketing. I think it's a problem in marketing because it was very rational and it was very paternalistic, and it was never really stated as a cause that we could all join in on. It was sort of a political philosophy. So I think language is one of the big challenges there. And the things I'm learning is, I think resilience. Are we building a resilient planet? competence absolutely matters, of course, you know. You hired them. So what did you see in them that you hired? Did they lie to you? And the question is it that they're incompetent, or is it that they're in the wrong place inside the organization? Are they incompetent? Do they have a lack of training? So is there a mechanism for somebody to say to you, so an organization that is well led you can have vulnerability. There's a circle of safety, there's vulnerability in that organization. Vulnerability doesn't mean we will walk around crying. Vulnerability means someone can walk into your office and say, I don't think I'm prepared to do this job that you've asked me to do. I don't feel qualified to do it. Or they can come to you and say, I made a mistake. Or they come to you and say, I'm scared. Or I'm having troubles at home. In other words, we don't know what's producing the failure or the struggle in the performance. It could be any host of things that may or may not be their competence. So the question is, do you have a mechanism to have that conversation? You talked about people who aren't passionate. Everyone's passionate, we're just not all passionate for the same things. Passion is a result, it's like profit, which is if I'm engaged in something that feeds my soul and I feel safe in the environment I'm in and I feel like I'm growing, I will be passionate. And so if you say that people are unpassionate inside the organization, I wouldn't blame the people. I'd say either they're in the wrong job, or you shouldn't have hired them because they don't actually fit your value set, or there's something going on in their life that maybe we should be concerned about them. Like, are you okay? Your passion is down. This is not like you. And what was the third point? And defensive. So if people are defensive, again, is there a culture of feedback? Do you have a culture where honest feedback is expected and required, which doesn't happen overnight? Are they put in environments where they can feel safe being criticized as opposed to feeling that they need to be defensive? Again, I don't blame the people. Do you have a communications training course? Do you teach effective confrontation? Because maybe the person being defensive, it's the person who's confronting them who doesn't know how to have a confrontation. And if you attack me that way, I'd be defensive too. So it's not always the people. We're so quick to say they're incompetent, they're not passionate, and they're defensive, and yet we don't look at ourselves and say, maybe I don't know how to have a confrontation, maybe I'm not being empathetic enough, and maybe we shouldn't have hired them or we put them in the wrong position. And then if we made a bad hire, we can't blame them for that. So how do we help? Because if we're not happy with them, they're not happy working, how do we help them find a new job with dignity? If you're truly in a toxic environment, one option is always to leave that environment, right? If it's a job, right? But that's not necessarily the only option. And this is sort of similar question that I get often, which is what happens if you're in middle management and senior management doesn't get any of this stuff, and they only care about numbers before people, not people before numbers. The answer is you ignore them because you can't influence or control that which you cannot control, and you take responsibility for the things you can control, in other words, yourself. And you become the leader you wish you had. You become a student of leadership, and you obsess about making sure that the people with whom you work, the people whose names you know and faces you recognize, that they are able to go home every day and say to their loved ones, I love my job, because of what you're doing for them. In other words, you commit yourself to the life of service. You commit yourself to the practice of leadership and taking care of the people over whom you can influence. They could be above you, below you, to the left or the right of you, but this very small enclave. And what starts to happen is these little subcultures start to emerge of incredible joy and happiness within more toxic environments because they're all taking care of each other. And what happens is one of those people gets moved and goes somewhere else. They take those lessons. They start to do the same thing. It starts to grow. The performance of those groups tends to be better than others. And if you get a critical mass, the tail wags the dog. The internal can actually change the direction of the entire organization. It takes time, though.
I think the short version of that is model the behavior that you want to see. And that is so true for each one of us all over in our lives. You know, how many people are complaining about the bitterness and the anger and the hostility in politics today? To what extent are we modeling the behavior that we want to see? So if you wished people treated each other with greater warm-heartedness in the face of overwhelming political contempt, how have you treated somebody with whom you disagree with warm-heartedness instead of with contempt? And each one of us can actually change the world a tiny little bit in the next 24 hours by doing exactly that. We're going to have an opportunity to do that. This is how we do it at work, but each one of us can model the behavior that we want to see in our ordinary lives. That's moral agency. My friends, that's power.
Amen. You don't have more than one why. A why is the purpose, cause, or belief upon which the organization exists that exists on a level higher than the thing that you do. So what you explained to me was what the company does, or you explained a strategic road to get to something else, right? So there is a purpose or cause that drives you. Are you the founder? So there's a purpose or cause that drives you, that you saw this as an effective means to advance whatever cause or belief that you believe in. And you saw that feeding people is a good strategy, is a good means to advance something that's even bigger than that. And if you didn't do this, you'd do something else. So you only have one why, and I would argue that you haven't yet articulated yet. And the reason that so you're having issues inside the organization where some people believe in this one, but some people believe in that one. That means you're not at the why. The why level says we all believe in this, we all work different ways to do it. So our organization, our why is to inspire people to do the things that inspire them. I haven't told you a single thing about what we do yet. And we have a vision that if everything we do comes to life, we can imagine a world in which the vast majority of people will wake up every single morning inspired to go to work, feel safe when they're there, and return home fulfilled at the end of the day. Now, what do we do? Well, inside the organization, there's all kinds of stuff. And we all are passionate about different ways to advance that. So I'm the dancing monkey who speaks and writes about it, right? And then there are folks inside our organization who want nothing to do with what I do. They would never want to do this, but they found ways to do it through taking care of the customer, like literally having the face-to-face. They love that. And they see that that is the best means to advance our cause, which is to have that face-to-face advice, right? But we all believe in the same cause.
The 4 big things that we've learned and heard from Simon Sinek today. Principle number 1, leaders who know their own why understand shared sacrifice, which is a privilege, not a negative. Principle number 2, ask yourself, what am I willing to fail for? If you can answer that, you're on track to understanding your why. Principle number 3 is that courage is the ability to act in the face of fear, but to do that, we need people we trust. Find those people you trust and be those people that other people can trust. And principle number 4 is that purpose matters more than happiness. So set upon your own purpose and help other people find theirs.
In the face of bombardment of manipulation, that's the marketplace. How do you get your message to stand out? How do you get your message heard? Why should anyone listen to you? This is the world we live in today. It's called stress. Again, I cannot dispute that every one of those manipulations work. They do. That's why companies use them. The problem is, none of them breed loyalty. There's an alternative. It's called inspiration. And there are a few leaders and a few organizations that rely vastly more on inspiration than manipulation. I'll talk about some of the big ones. We know who they are. Apple Computers, Southwest Airlines, Harley Davidson, Virgin. Every single one of these organizations, these leaders, those with the ability to inspire, they have the most loyal employees. They have the most loyal customers. They can charge a premium if they want to. They're more profitable. They're more innovative, my definition. And most importantly, they can sustain all these things for the long term. What I discovered is that regardless of their size and regardless of their industry, every single one of these organizations with the capacity to inspire, they all think, act, and communicate the exact same way, and it's the complete opposite to everyone else. All I did was write it down, and it's probably the world's simplest idea. I call it the golden circle. Imagine, if you will, 3 concentric circles, a bullseye. In the middle is the word why, in the center ring is the word how, and the outside ring is the word what. It's this little idea that distinguishes those with the capacity to inspire versus everyone else. Let me define the terms really quickly, starting from the outside in. Every single organization on the planet knows what they do. These are the products you sell or the services you offer. Some know how they do it, whether you call it your differentiating value proposition or your USP or your proprietary process. It's the things that you think make you special or different or better than your competition. But very, very few people and very, very few organizations can clearly state what needs. But a leader, to be a leader, must have followers. You're not a leader unless there are those who volunteer to follow you. You cannot force someone to follow you. They have to choose to follow you. Whether they're customers or employees, friends, investors, supporters, they choose, they volunteer to help you get what you want. Why should they? Why should they bother? What leaders do is they inspire people to be a part of what they're doing. They inspire people to follow in the direction that they're going. At the end of the day, there are only 2 ways to influence human behavior. You can either manipulate it or you can inspire it. Those are your options. We all know how manipulation works. Manipulation in business, right? You drop your price low enough, people will do business with you. This is the concept behind a sale. Things are priced to move. It works. It's manipulative. Promotions, 2 for 1, free toy inside, or if you're in the B2B space, we call it value added. Same idea, it's a promotion. It's giving stuff away for free to reduce someone's risks, they'll choose you over the competition. We see manipulation a lot in marketing. Fear, wonderful manipulator. Any parents in the audience, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Fear is a wonderful manipulator. You can get people to do all kinds of things. We're often told you have to be aspirational. Yes, it's good to be positive, but it's still a manipulation. I like to joke that you can get people to join the gym with an aspirational message, but to get them to go 3 days a week, that requires a little bit of inspiration. Or what a lot of organizations like to call innovation. It's really novelty, right? Because real innovation changes the course of industries, if not society. The fax machine, the microwave, the light bulb, iTunes, that's real innovation. Adding a camera to your cell phone, wonderful feature, not an innovation. It is stressful to be a consumer these days. It is stressful to try to decide what to buy when you are bombarded day after day with manipulation from all kinds of organizations. Which TV should I buy? Which cell phone company should I go with? Which IT solution should I get for my office? It's called stress.